The silent observer. Who is watching the mind? Buddhist wisdom. Right now you are hearing these words. Sound reaches the ear. Meaning begins to form. A thought may appear before the sentence is finished. And somehow, you know that the thought is there. Who knows it? The first answer usually comes at once. I do. I am hearing. I am thinking. I am aware. In ordinary life, this answer is enough. Someone calls your name, and you turn. Your hand touches a hot surface and pulls away. Sadness appears, and you say, I am sad. Language gathers every event around a familiar center. This sense of I. The difficulty begins when attention turns toward that center. Try to locate the one who is listening right now. Perhaps it seems to sit somewhere behind the eyes. Look more closely, and you may find pressure in the face, an image of the head, or an inner voice saying, I am here. Each of these can be noticed. Even the sentence, I am the one who notices, arrives as another thought, something observed, not the observer itself. Perhaps the observer is awareness itself, the knowing quality that seems to remain even as everything else moves. That possibility can feel deeply convincing. Sounds change, feelings change, thoughts appear and vanish, yet awareness seems to stay, like a screen that remains while images flicker across it. But look at awareness itself. It narrows under fear. It scatters through exhaustion. It sharpens when attention is steady and dims when the body is ill. It disappears entirely in dreamless sleep and returns without being summoned each morning. Whatever we expected to find standing still behind experience turns out to be moving too. There is an emotional reason we may want the observer to remain untouched. Bodies age, relationships end, familiar roles disappear. If everything outside can be lost, then surely something inside must be safe, a quiet witness that remains no matter what happens. A permanent observer seems to offer that shelter. The wish is understandable, but a wish, however deep, does not become a discovery just because it feels like one. Now a strange loop appears. Whatever we find can become something observed. A sensation is observed. A memory is observed. The inner voice is observed. Even the feeling of being the observer. That too can be noticed. The observer seems to retreat each time we approach it. One fact remains. Knowing is happening. The owner remains impossible to locate. Perhaps the word who has already placed a person inside the experience before we understood what that person is. You were not born with a story about yourself. A child does not wake up thinking, I am smart, or I am not enough. These stories are learned. A name is given. Praise and blame arrive. Certain qualities bring approval. Others bring silence or punishment. Over years, these responses become an inner picture, and we begin to see ourselves through remembered judgments and imagined eyes. This picture is useful. It helps us navigate relationships, make commitments, and take responsibility. A promise made yesterday still carries weight today. Harm has consequences, and care has consequences. The Buddha never denied this practical level of the person. But the picture can also become a prison. A single failure starts to feel like proof of being a failure. A changing role, from parent to empty nester, from worker to retiree, feels like losing one's whole identity. We defend the picture as though defending ourselves, because we have confused the map for the territory. Alan Watts once described this confusion simply: the common sense of self as a small center of awareness locked inside the body, peering out through the eyes like a person looking through windows. The image feels natural, but the living reality of a human being is far larger and more fluid than any picture the mind can hold. The word I gathers many things into one name: the body, memories, habits, hopes, wounds, relationships. These elements show continuity, but continuity does not require permanence. Think about a river. You can visit it tomorrow, and it will still be there. Yet not a single drop of water stays the same. The body changes constantly. Memory selects and distorts. Beliefs develop. Emotion alters how the world appears. Something continues, but nothing stays fixed. The Buddhist word anatta, usually translated as not self, invites us to look at this directly. Not as a belief to adopt, but as a question to carry into lived experience. Can any part of this changing process serve as a permanent owner, an independent essence, or a complete controller? The question is not meant to produce despair. It is meant to produce clarity, to help us see what is actually here, rather than what we assumed must be here. The Buddha treated this question with unusual care. When the wanderer Vacchagotta asked him directly, "Does a self exist?" the Buddha remained silent. When Vacchagotta then asked, "Does no self exist?" the Buddha remained silent again. He later explained to Ananda that saying yes would support the belief in an eternal soul, while saying no would push Vacchagotta toward the belief that a person is finally destroyed into nothing. Both answers would miss the point. The inquiry could not be reduced to a slogan. To go further, we need to stop talking about the self in general terms and enter one specific moment of experience. Because the self is not a theory. It is something that reassembles itself in every act of seeing, hearing, and feeling. To understand it, we have to catch it in the act. Imagine opening a message from someone important to you. One sentence feels cold and dismissive. Within seconds, your chest tightens. A reply begins forming before you have decided to respond. The whole event seems simple. They hurt me. Look closer. At first, there are shapes on a screen. The eye is working. The shapes are present, and seeing happens. Not because a person is looking through the eyes, but because eye and form have met. The Buddha called this meeting contact. From contact, a feeling tone appears. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This is not yet the full emotion. It is simpler and faster than that, just a basic coloring of the experience. And around that coloring, the mind begins to move. This feeling tone is easily missed because it happens so fast, but it is the hinge on which everything turns. The mind wants pleasant feeling to continue, wants unpleasant feeling to end, and barely notices neutral feeling at all. Most of what we call emotional life begins right here, at a point so brief we usually skip past it entirely. The unpleasant tone triggers resistance. Memory brings in the history of the relationship. An urge to defend appears. A story about respect, rejection, and who I am wraps itself around what began as shapes on a screen. A large personal drama has grown from a brief flicker of unpleasant feeling. The Buddha described this sequence with striking precision in the 𝐂𝐴𝐴𝐽𝐴 Sutta. I and form condition I consciousness. Their meeting is contact. Feeling depends on contact. Craving can grow from feeling. The same structure runs through every sense: ear and sound, nose and odor, tongue and taste, body and touch. And then a step that changes everything. The mind itself is treated as a sixth sense. Its objects are thoughts, memories, images, and ideas. When a thought is known, mind consciousness has arisen, with the mind and a mental object as its conditions. This matters deeply. When you notice a thought, no second person is required inside the head. A thought becomes an object of mind consciousness, the same way a sound becomes an object of ear consciousness. Knowing happens as an event, not as a person standing behind the event. Notice something strange. When you say, "I am watching my anger," that sentence itself is a thought. You can notice it appearing. So who is watching the watcher? Another thought. And who watches that? You could keep going forever. But maybe the question is not who is at the top of this chain. Maybe the chain does not need a top. The Mahātthānasankaya Sutta makes this vivid. A monk named Sati believed that the same consciousness travels through life as a permanent knower, the one who speaks, who feels, who experiences everything. The Buddha corrected him firmly. Consciousness arises fresh each time, depending on its conditions. He gave a simple comparison. Fire is named according to what it burns. A wood fire depends on wood. A grass fire depends on grass. Take away the fuel, and the fire does not go somewhere. It ceases because its conditions have ceased. Consciousness works the same way. Seeing depends on the eye and form. Hearing depends on the ear and sound. Thinking depends on the mind and an idea. Each moment of knowing is a new event, born from fresh conditions. There is no single flame traveling from candle to candle. There is no permanent knower moving from experience to experience, collecting memories like a traveler collecting stamps. What we call my consciousness is a name for a stream of events, each one arising, each one passing, each one depending on conditions that are themselves changing. But here the mind often makes one more move. It says, "Fine. Thoughts change, feelings change, the body changes. But I am the one who watches all of it change. I am the constant." Awareness itself, pure, untouched, always present, must be what I really am. It is a compelling thought. It is also the last place the sense of self can hide. Now the observer itself must enter the investigation. Learning to observe the mind can create genuine space around emotion. Anger is recognized before it becomes speech. Fear is felt before it becomes escape. This space allows choice, and that is valuable. But something else can happen quietly. The earlier belief was, "I am angry." The refined belief becomes, "I am the awareness watching anger." The identity has moved from the emotion to the observation. The costume has changed, but the habit of ownership may remain. Watch what happens in a difficult moment. Anger appears, and a voice inside says, "I should not feel this." That voice seems wiser than the anger, calmer, more composed. But look at where it comes from. It carries learned ideals about who you should be. It carries memories of past conflict. It carries fear of losing control. The judge and the anger serve different functions, yet both are built from the same materials: memory, conditioning, learned images of self. One part of the mind has claimed authority over another part of the same mind. Krishnamurti captured this in a phrase worth sitting with: "The observer is the observed." He meant something inward, that the part of the mind which judges fear or anger is itself made from the same memory and conditioning it claims to stand above. Seeing this does not destroy discernment. It removes the fiction of an untouched controller, so that clear action can happen without inner conflict between two fragments of one process. The Buddha's examination reaches the same place through a different door. In the Anaṭtalakkhana Sutta, consciousness receives the same test as every other part of experience. Is it permanent? It changes, sometimes sharp, sometimes foggy, sometimes absent altogether. Can it be fully commanded? Try to keep your mind perfectly still for 5 minutes. Within seconds, thoughts will arise unbidden, attention will drift, sounds will pull awareness sideways. If consciousness were truly you would have full authority over it, but you do not. Does holding it as myself bring lasting peace? It brings anxiety whenever clarity fades, because now I am fading. It brings fear whenever awareness wavers, because now I am under threat. The sense I am watching can itself be watched. It may feel centered and spacious in meditation, then vanish completely in a moment of panic or deep sleep. It grows under certain conditions and weakens under others. Whatever rises and falls with conditions is itself conditioned. Adding another watcher behind it only moves the question back one step, like placing a mirror in front of a mirror. This may feel unsettling. If no one is watching, what holds everything together? What prevents chaos? But consider, the absence of a permanent watcher does not mean the absence of knowing. Rain falls without anyone doing the raining. Wind blows without a blower behind it. A river flows without a director guiding each drop. And knowing happens, vivid, immediate, undeniable, without requiring a fixed knower behind it. The process does not need an owner to continue. It never did. The search does not end with the discovery of a hidden subject. It ends with a recognition. Observation occurs because the conditions for knowing are present. Attention, contact, consciousness, and mindfulness come together, and knowing happens. A permanent observer cannot be found among them, and knowing does not need one. A changing self can still be responsible. In fact, change is what makes responsibility meaningful. If anger were simply what you are, a fixed substance embedded in your nature, then no transformation would be possible. You would be permanently angry, and no practice, no teaching, and no choice could alter that fact. But that is not how it works. Intentions develop habits. Habits shape perception. Perception shapes action. A person who feeds resentment becomes more ready to resent. A person who practices patience, who meets the same provocation with curiosity instead of defense, moves in another direction entirely. The Buddha organized his teaching around this possibility. Suffering has a structure. It can be understood, and it can end. Not through discovering a secret about reality, but through a path that transforms the way we relate to experience. He described this path in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These 8 factors do not simply correct a philosophical mistake about the self. They work on the deep habits that keep rebuilding the mistake moment after moment. Ethical conduct comes first, not as a rule imposed from outside, but because the mind cannot be separated from the life it leads. Think about it honestly. When you have lied to someone, a part of the mind must now maintain the lie, remembering what was said, watching for exposure, constructing the next layer. That mind is not free to observe itself clearly. It is too busy defending. Deception strengthens the identity that must be protected. Cruel speech keeps anger circulating. Exploitation feeds craving. When speech, action, and livelihood become less harmful, something quietly settles inside. Regret decreases. The mind becomes less turbulent, and only a less turbulent mind can see clearly. Concentration gives the mind stability, the capacity to stay with an experience long enough to actually see it. Without stability, insight remains too brief to matter. You notice that anger is conditioned, and then anger sweeps you away for the next 30 minutes. The Satipatthana Sutta describes the training simply. When the mind has desire, know it as a mind with desire. When the mind has aversion, know it as a mind with aversion. When contracted, know it is contracted. When scattered, know it is scattered. Notice what the Buddha does not say. He never says, find the observer. He never says, establish a witness behind your thoughts. He never says, step back and watch from a safe distance. He says, know. That is all. A mind with desire, known. A mind free from desire, known. Not I am desiring, not I am the awareness beyond desire. Just, this state is present. Knowing is happening. It does not need an owner. And wisdom, the deepest factor, sees the whole process clearly. Return one more time to that painful message. There is seeing. Meaning is recognized. An unpleasant feeling arises. The body contracts. An urge appears. A story forms. Each part can be known. Each part arose because of conditions. Each part is changing. None of it is me. This does not make a person cold. The opposite happens. When you are no longer defending a rigid image of yourself in every interaction, something opens. You can actually listen. You can feel the hurt without being consumed by it. You can choose a response based on understanding rather than survival. Genuine observation stays in full contact with emotion, the pressure in the chest, the hurt beneath the anger, the wish to strike back, and the recognition that a wise boundary is needed. It becomes escape only when used to avoid feeling. The Mahasalayatthana Sutta brings this together with remarkable directness. When the six senses, their objects, consciousness, contact, and feeling are not understood, fascination grows, clinging tightens, and suffering follows. When these same processes are seen clearly, as they arise, as they change, as they cease, attachment loses its grip. Craving declines. Not because you have suppressed desire through willpower, but because you have seen through the mechanism that generates it. The discourse names this destination clear knowing and release, and places it within the full development of the Noble Eightfold Path. Practice begins wherever you are. Notice the feeling tone in the next charged moment, the pleasant pull of approval, the unpleasant sting of criticism, the neutral hum of a moment that barely registers. Notice what the mind does around that tone. Does it reach for more? Does it resist? Does it build a story about who you are? Just notice. Not to fix anything, but to see how much of what feels like self is actually a reaction to a passing feeling. As this becomes familiar, something begins to shift. Not because you have accepted a new belief, but because you are seeing for yourself. You see that anger depends on an unpleasant feeling, a memory, and an expectation. Change one condition, and the anger changes too. You see that the observer depends on attention, calm, and a particular mental posture. Change those conditions, and the observer also changes. This is not theory. It is not something you read and agreed with. It is direct knowledge of how experience actually works. And it quietly loosens the belief that the observer, the anger, or the person behind them is a fixed part of who you are. One small note. Mindfulness without ethics can become self-absorption. Observation without concentration may be too weak to see clearly. Insight without compassion can become another way of judging yourself. The path holds conduct, stability, and understanding together, not as separate stages, but as qualities that need each other. We began by searching for the one who watches the mind. We looked behind the eyes, inside the thoughts, underneath the feelings. We found sensations, memories, reactions, attention, consciousness, all arising through conditions, all changing, none of them sitting still long enough to be the permanent observer. And yet knowing never stopped. Throughout the entire search, experience continued. Seeing happened. Hearing happened. Understanding happened. At no point did the absence of a fixed observer create darkness or emptiness. The lights did not go out because no one owned them. What remained was a living process. Intimate, immediate, responsive, and without an owner. The next time something shakes you, a harsh word, a sudden loss, an old fear returning, you might notice the familiar pull to become someone, the victim, the fighter, the one who should not feel this way. And you might also notice that before any of those stories formed, there was just this: contact, feeling, and a moment of knowing. Stay there, even briefly, before the story, before the identity, before the question, who is experiencing this? Not to find the one who knows, but to see that knowing is already here, and it has never needed anyone to own it. That is where the question comes to rest, and that is where the path begins.